how operating models help to set up your product organization for success. It's my pleasure to introduce you to my co-speaker as well. It's Teresa. She's joining us from San Diego. I'm originally from Germany, but now based in London. I'm really looking forward to sharing what we've learned about operating models with you today. We bring together our respective backgrounds to help organizations transform. My background is in growing customer-centric product and innovation capabilities and also their leadership. And Teresa's is in organizational change and leadership development to help our clients become more customer-centric product organizations. And that's just a fancy way of saying that we want to help companies to address real customer problems instead of pushing products on them. Through this work, we've learned a lot about how companies structure themselves, make decisions, and work together to drive product value. We've become fascinated by how their operating models can either accelerate or inhibit unlocking innovation and delivering great customer experiences. And we've joined forces and collaborate often to focus on this. And we look forward to sharing with you what we've learned along the way.
So we think that this quote does a really nice job of framing up what we're here to talk about today. So we think about more traditional or larger enterprise companies who increasingly feel pressure to be more customer-centric, to be able to get value out in front of their customers more quickly and in an iterative manner. And because of competitive pressures, things, trends that are happening in the market, et cetera. And so they've really started to look outside of kind of the traditional players within their space and think about, are there aspects of business models that we can take from other companies and that have been successful in doing this? And in particular, tech companies have been, organizations that have served and have shown that they can get value out very quickly. And so we're starting to see some of these elements really seep into, as it says in this quote, into a lot of different industries. And so we wanted to start by just as we get into this, framing what we mean when we say operating model, because it's over and over again. It's one of those phrases that often is talked about, but I'm not sure that we all have the exact same definition of what it is. For us, operating model is actually pretty straightforward. It's how does an organization run itself? What are all the components that come together to allow an organization to deliver value? And more specifically, we have framed it from the lens of, Martina and I think about it from the lens of 4 components. So those 4 components are structure, ways of working, decision-making, and capabilities. And so often organizations will start with structure. So they'll start with, if we just reorganize, if we move things around on the org chart, if we can set a product fitting in here, we're going to move product over here, that will solve all of our problems. And it very rarely does. If you look at structure in isolation, you have to also look at these other pieces together, the broader components of the operating model ecosystem. So the second piece for us is ways of working. And that gets at how do teams and how do individuals collaborate? So what are the practices that they use? What are the mindsets and the cultural norms that they bring into working together? The third one, decision-making, and we see over and over again with the different companies we work with, how important this is. And so decision-making for us is, how are priorities set? How are, who gets to make what decisions? What are the accountabilities? And at all altitudes. So from executive level through to middle managers, through to teams, who are on the ground building different things. So decision-making really fundamental. And fourth, capabilities. And capabilities are the things that actually make all the other parts of the operating model work. So for us, capabilities are, do you have the right roles? Do you have people in those roles with the background and the experience and the skill sets? Do you have the processes and the tools that enable you to work in these ways, enable that updated structure to be able to deliver the results you want? So that's what we think of as an operating model. And as we start down the path of talking to organizations about, great, you have a strategy that you want to get to, you realize you need to evolve in order to get there. How do they think about that? How do they get started? And so for us, we think about 5 elements. And we first start by understanding where a company is at today, and then how which of these different elements are really levers that they need to focus on in order to evolve that operating model to get to their strategy. So first element is organizational and product maturity. And so if you think about what we would kind of call the modern practices that you need to be able to really iteratively deliver valuable products. So product management being a core one, design, there are a lot of modern engineering practices that are really important. So, how mature is the organization in not only those individual disciplines, but bringing them together collectively to work? Strategic impact and innovation is the second one. So of course, everyone has, wants to make a strategic impact, but when you break it down and think about it on a relative lens, how much of what needs to happen is really, really pushing innovation? It's very unknown, and you need an operating model that supports being able to go get evidence around work that is like a big bet that is unknown. And how much of it is more, it's known, but we need to be able to do it faster. We need to do it in more of a customer-centered way, or some hybrid. Again, that can have an impact on thinking about how to change your operating model. Third, customer journey and connection. So it seems so fundamental, but we see, so many organizations struggle with this. What customer segments are you focused on? Do you deeply understand the journey that they go on across products or across functions within your organization? Are your respective customer segments completely independent, or do they enable each other through some sort of a relationship? And so again, the complexity of that can impact how you want to drive your operating model. Speed to value. So never heard in all the executive teams that we've worked with, we've never ever heard someone say, hey, we don't want to focus on speed to value. It's always important, but it's a relative thing again, right? So if you're a technology company, you're pushing different things every single day, multiple times a day. But if you're a more traditional organization, let's say maybe a manufacturing type of enterprise, then it's relative. Speed to value is important, but it's not going to be the same as something that is ground up a technology company. And again, that can factor in how you think about your operating model. And last, but definitely not the least of the important things here, is risk. So are you a regulated industry, financial services, healthcare, et cetera? Do you have a great brand? And there's a lot of brand risk if you go do things that don't align with that. So that can factor in as to how you think about putting together these different components of an operating model. So we're going to bring this to life in the context of two different case studies so that we can show you how different companies went about this. The first one is a more traditional company that will walk through how they started to evolve their operating model. And then we'll do a second that started as a technology company, but still had a real opportunity to evolve that model in order to get to their strategy. So this first case study is a North American Fortune 50 retailer. So just to give you a little sense of size and scale, they are over 3,000 stores, hundreds of thousands of employees, and have done very well, have been very successful financially. And but what they started to see was just a couple of different challenges. One is different kind of non-traditional entrants starting to push into their market. They also started to see that they had customers who were demanding a more coherent experience with them, a more cohesive experience, because they were buying multiple different products, but the organization was very much structured functionally. So you have merchandising, you have marketing, you have store operations, you have online, and then within merchandising, you have by product line. And so everyone thought of their piece of the puzzle, not necessarily as an integrated whole. So one of the first big challenges they had was, how do we really get an integrated view of that customer experience when all of our structures and our decision-making processes are not aligned from that perspective? And so they initially started down the path of introducing some agile concepts, specifically extreme programming, the XP version. But it was very focused on executing again within components of the organization, not about knitting these pieces together. So they pretty quickly plateaued in terms of being able to see benefits. The second real challenge that they had was around being able to execute really complex, large-scale things. So in order to get to their strategy, they really, really had to make some big bets and multi-million-dollar types of things. So again, they needed to be able to work in this kind of much more collaborative, dynamic environment. So if we look at how they fit in this relative to the 5 elements that I introduced earlier, and just to give you a quick guide to what the way that this shows up. So the really bright reddish pink was their starting point, and the lighter pink was where we collectively decided like we need to move the needle on this element in order to get to where their operating model needed to be to enable their strategy. So org product and maturity, as I mentioned, they had started to introduce some agile practices. So they had some level of product management in that concept. As an example, they had some level of design, but it was really new. It had really grown up organically within the organization as well. So they needed to have more maturity around that, or they were never going to be able to connect these different groups together to deliver upon these big initiatives. Strategic impact and innovation, I talked about that a second ago. They needed to do some of these really complex, big things that were critical for their organization. So they needed product, they needed technology to have a seat at the table on these conversations, not to be an afterthought that then would say, hey, we can't actually do it that way. Thanks for coming up with that plan, but it won't work. So they needed to fundamentally think differently about the operating model that was going to enable those big strategic things. Customer journey, I mentioned earlier, they had a set of customers who was saying, hey, we can't keep interacting with you in the same way. We need you to have a more holistic view of the way that we work with you. So a very significant need to evolve that. Speed to value, important, but relatively speaking, not the same degree, again, as like a full tech company. So they wanted to make some improvements, but it wasn't a huge driver for their operating model. Risk, not a regulated industry, already had some good guardrails in place. So of the elements, one that they wanted to not lose sight of, but wasn't a major driver. So they really focused on, in terms of the elements, the 4 components of the operating model, they focused on structure, decision-making, and capabilities. From a ways of working standpoint, they had, as a result of the introduction of some of the agile practices, they had some good foundations to grow from. So I'm going to quickly run you through sort of 3 evolutions of where they went in terms particularly of structure and decision-making. So their starting point, as I mentioned previously, and this is just a small subset of a representative org chart, right? So their starting point, as I mentioned previously, was they started to add agile product teams, but within technology. So the merchandising VP that you see on this chart was really a merchandising IT VP, right? So it was a technology VP, and they had product teams, but they were constrained to the technology organization. So we still had the challenge of merchandising decides on what to do and hands it into the product teams. And then, it wasn't exactly, the product teams didn't entirely understand it, or they had a different way of doing it. And so there were these disconnects. And we still have the issue of, if we're trying to solve a customer problem holistically, merchandising was handing their thing to their teams, marketing was handing their things to their teams, et cetera, et cetera. So we still had the functional issue, even though they'd introduced some of these really, really important new practices that were foundational. So their next iteration was to start to introduce particularly the product management concepts more broadly. And so they started to enable those in particular in the business side of the organization. And that was good because people started to have more of a shared understanding of what are some of the fundamentals of really good product development. But the challenge was often they were just added to people who already had other roles, product marketing roles, business lead roles, and they just tacked on some product management to it. So it wasn't really still core, and it wasn't integrated. We still had this happening within separate organizations. So in their next evolution, it really focused on adding a chief product and experience officer. So you can see the CPO to the right here in this diagram. And so the CPO focused on how do we really enable more consistency in terms of what is product management. Also had responsibility for design. What are these roles? What are the core practices that we all need to be following? How do we actually make sure we're hiring people in with the skill sets? So there was just a lot to take what was some good organic growth, but provide some consistency so that people were talking and working together using some same principles and language. The other thing the CPO very much focused on was decision-making. So he really quickly realized that, we can do all of these other things and get people working together, but we have so many priorities because this function's setting priorities and marketing setting priorities and operations setting priorities and so, and we aren't holistically thinking about what are the highest value things to do in order to deliver these for our customer. And then once we've identified those, can we do them? Do we actually have the right people in the right places and the right investments and things to actually enable these things to come to life? So he spent a lot of time addressing those issues as well. And so in terms of their progress, as far as where they were at, they really, did a lot of great work to have more of a common language and framework for how they actually identify, define, deliver product value. They also used objectives and key results was the tool that they used to really align objectives. Even though people were part of different structures from a hierarchical standpoint, they aligned their objectives and made clear what does success look like by using that tool across team. And they moved to have a more consistent, flexible decision-making structure that really looked at, of these big bets, what ones really have things that are uncertain that we need to govern differently and oversee differently than other things. So a tremendous amount of progress, still a lot of opportunities. So you probably noticed on the previous chart that the CPO role, the Chief Product and Experience Officer role, still reported into technology. So even though he very much had a seat at the table and was really influential, by definition of where he just sat in the structure, it constrained some of the ability to have an impact. So that was one area that they really had to continue to work on, is how do they actually think about things holistically, still not within these functions, because they were very deeply rooted. There was a lot of muscle memory built around working in a functional way. So that's one example of a more traditional company and how they started down the path to evolve their operating model. Martina is going to take you through a second one, which started in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our second case study has quite a different starting point and quite a different scale, not just the organization, but also their transformation journey to date. So this is a mid-sized technology company with a couple of thousand employees, so much smaller as a starting point. They're an online marketplace, and they've only been around for about 20 years. And like Teresa's example, they've really started from the ground up with a product discipline. And as a technology company, they are also benefiting from having other aspects of that modern product company operating model already in place. But as they started to mature as a company, they ran into new challenges. When they added more products, they didn't quite anticipate just the scale of that additional complexity of their customer journeys across all of these new products. Similar to Teresa's retail company example, they found it really challenging to align their priorities. And although they had a lot of good building blocks of product capability, they still had a lot of challenges to deliver a unified customer experience across the whole customer journey, now that it involved multiple products and platforms. And secondly, at the same time, the industry was becoming a lot more competitive, and they needed to address their speed to value. So if we look at the 5 elements in this example, they implemented their product capability very early on, which allowed them to have a consistent approach to their practice and help them to execute at a tactical level. So still some room for improvement to mature their product practice for a more strategic impact. Innovation was a critical driver when they entered the market, but at this point in the maturity, it's not the main driver to success. So no additional focus to grow that capability. When it comes to customer journey and connection, it was really more challenges with working across the teams. Across the organization, success was seen as delivering in your functional silo and not across the whole customer journey. And it really wasn't easy to collaborate and prioritize across those silos, which really slowed down their value delivery, which brings us to that speed to value, which is absolutely critical for them to stay competitive. One of their key challenges, but working in a fast-moving market, it's also difficult to keep up with the competition. Risk, very similar to Teresa's example, not a particularly regulated market, and fair amount of risk, but nothing that they would need to focus any further on than they already do. So where did they start? A more modest start, as you might notice, but how did they evolve the operating model? They decided to focus on improving that decision-making across the org first. And if we look at their starting point, you notice that project teams are really pulled together from multiple disciplines to execute on a product. You can see that, a good starting point with bringing product managers, designers, engineering, maybe data analytics together. This helped them to shift tactically, but it didn't necessarily enable them to focus across that end-to-end journey across all of the growing products and platforms that they're adding to that customer journey. And additionally, they also got disbanded at the end of a project. So that knowledge that the team built up together over time dissipated back into the organization. So their decision-making and their culture caused a lot of collaboration challenges between these functions. And particular example here between marketing and product. Again, this is only a simplified snapshot of a larger organization. So we wanted to focus on one of those areas where they identified some friction and wanted to solve a collaboration challenge. So product marketing had been working separately on their own, also trying to drive great customer outcomes, but really defining outcomes that they felt will best deliver on product strategy, and would then hand that off to product management and engineering teams to deliver on that. So if we're looking at the first step on the transformation journey, focusing on improving that decision-making in their operating model, they moved to persistent product teams. And they included product marketing to better align that sort of friction point in their cross-functional collaboration. But as you can see here, they didn't make any structural changes to the org chart, but enabled decision-making across previous functional silos by bringing practices together that need to collaborate to execute on a product. But unlike in Teresa's example, where structural changes might help cement some of those collaboration approaches, more further to go on this journey to help teams work together across the end-to-end experience. So if we look at their progress, obviously early days, but they've moved from an alignment of a function to an alignment around a product team, but not yet across the whole customer journey. They've improved and aligned around decision-making within the teams, including more functional verticals, but they're still missing clarity around priorities and alignment on goals across that end-to-end customer experiences, which is really not helping in aligning across decision-making across the company. So going forward, this organization still has a lot of opportunity to address decision-making beyond the team level. They need to expand their shared ways of working so everyone is moving towards the same outcomes. And they may introduce cultural norms that encourage collaboration across boundaries. For example, shared goals, as Teresa was mentioning, with OKRs, success measures, and incentives, but also shared principles around how to work together. And they need to think about their structure to align with the customer journeys instead of their functional verticals to enable more coherent end-to-end experience. So where might you start? Teresa can talk you through that.
So each company, it's important to understand where you're at against these elements and to think about relative to the strategy and to the outcomes that you're trying to get to, which of these levers needs to be pulled or needs to be most pushed upon in order to be able to achieve those objectives. And we would love to tell you that that this is a mathematical equation where if you put in these different elements, out pops the exact operating model that you need to have. But the reality is that it's very much also art, and that it's important to get started and to experiment along the way to understand which of these are going to actually move the needle on the key things that are important to get to your strategy. All that said, we do have a few guiding principles that we encourage everyone to think about that we've learned in terms of doing this work across a lot of different industries now. And so there is a real need to think about what's the right balancing and consistency in practices with the need for agility and responsiveness. They're not mutually exclusive, but there are some cases where you have really immature practices and you do need to have a little bit more of either centralization or guardrails or control to some degree in order to have things work together. And sometimes that does impact responsiveness. So it's thinking about how do you actually make sure that you're doing that in a way that contributes towards the outcomes, but still not locking the teams down so that they can't work. Second point, how do you understand, again, as we've mentioned, the differences in the types of strategic initiatives? They're not all the same. Make sure that you're not just using the exact same structure, one size fits all. If there is a need for some flexibility in terms of something that is really unknown, needs discovery work, something that just needs to be well executed. Third point, really critical, align goals cross-functionally. If you're using OKRs, you're using OGSMs, you're using whatever framework, it doesn't matter so much the specific tool as it matters that you're aligning and you're providing clarity on decision-making around these things. And then the adjustment of risk tolerance and speed to value, how to think about those relatively speaking. How we always want to ideally move decision-making as close as we can to the product team, to those who have the most data and can make the best decision, but it needs to be within some level of boundaries and context.
Brilliant. And just like products, operating models are not static. They should evolve over time to remain fit for purpose, but also to set everyone in the organization up for success, to deliver organizational and customer outcomes. Just a quick summary slide. We can stop here to have time to take a couple of questions.
I think we can wrap up this slide, and then I'll have just one or two questions to finish. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So just quickly to summarize what we've been talking about, think about all four components of the operating model. It's tempting to start at the structure and stay there. It's important that you enable that alignment and facilitate those connections across the products and the functions. And it's not just about managing products and managing product managers. To be able to have an impact at organizational level, you need to be able to impact the operating model as a product organization. So your culture needs to be enabled, needs to enable all of those things with goals, aligned incentives, cultural norms that help teams across the whole organization work in the same direction. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Martina and Teresa. I have it was quite interesting that right now in my organization, we have like the same thoughts that we need to change the culture and the organization. And we have the same thing that it comes up from the IT department. So I was wondering, is it a common situation that the IT division thrives those changes to the whole company, or does it usually go from the CEO?
It's a great question, and we will tell you that a lot of the companies we work with, it starts in the technology organization, and we think it's because the technology organization is thinking about like what are these, what are more modern practices that we can start to adopt, whether it's agile or it's product or it's user-centered design, et cetera. And they start down the path of thinking about these, and then kind of quickly realize, as we talked about in our talk here, that just adding one practice doesn't actually change the organization, that you have to think more broadly about the other pieces. And so they usually then start to bring that message to senior leaders and to start to bring also to their business counterparts. So it is actually quite common for it to start in a technology organization for those reasons. We have seen, very thoughtful business leaders also bring those things out, but truthfully, it's usually technology that drives a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. And it also seems that quite a big challenge in such case to sell the whole restructure and all those interesting practices to other parts of the team, because they are not common with those ideas and solutions. Can you give maybe 2 or 3 tips how to motivate other teams, not IT engineering teams, to implement those changes in the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start and Martina can pile on here, but focusing on the outcome. It's not about we want to work in this particular way. We want to introduce this new practice. We have this new cool tool we want to do. It's like, what difference does it make? So what? So really focusing on that outcome, about the value that you want to drive, about being able to very quickly iterate and get customer feedback that can help drive, what you're doing, and being able to provide examples of, based on getting things out quickly, we actually saved millions and millions of whatever currency that you work in because we didn't do the wrong thing. That's ultimately the way to have that conversation. The how comes later. It's the what, the impact that you want to have that you have to start with.
I wonder, as I have been doing quite a lot of, let's say, also organizational change with a product perspective in recent years, how do you help organizations make sense of the mess that you uncover once you get into that topic? Because my experience is that once you really dig into each of these topics, you go down diverse rabbit holes, and people are often very much overwhelmed, especially given that they have a daily business to run, and their other responsibilities are often not taken away. So there's a big mess on top of everything else. How do you help them?
Similar process to how you might solve a customer problem, with starting with discovery, understanding where are the challenges, what is stopping them from working, getting to those outcomes in a better way, and then we're prioritizing. Okay, which ones of these are the biggest challenges to your success? Perhaps aligning to organizational goals, to overall organizational strategy. What is going to have the most impact if we're trying to solve this problem first with you? And then actually co-designing, co-creating. What is an iteration of that look like? And not just the future state, but also some experimentation, some steps in terms of iterating and implementing and trying this out, and starting small, experimenting, learning from that, and scaling that up as we see different approaches getting to a better outcome with the team.
So you also basically
not everything at once, but starting with key issues.
So you're basically applying product thinking in order for organizational design, actually.